There's a certain kind of smugness that only HOA presidents possess. And Karen? She had perfected it. Which is why on this bright Tuesday morning, she was standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, arms crossed, radiating pure, self-righteous fury. And why? Because she had just called the police on an elderly woman, my mother. The scene of the crime. A police car came speeding into the neighborhood, lights flashing, siren cutting through the calm suburban air. Neighbors peeked through their blinds. Joggers slowed down, whispering. A few HOA board members stood nearby, watching the drama unfold. Karen stood front and center, chin lifted like she had just single-handedly saved the community. The moment the police officer stepped out, she pounced. "There she is!" Karen barked, pointing directly at my mother, who was sitting peacefully on a bench, drinking her morning tea. The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, what exactly?" "She's causing trouble," Karen snapped. "She refuses to follow HOA rules." The officer glanced at my mother, an elderly woman, holding a teacup, in her own yard. He blinked. Karen folded her arms, smirking. "She needs to be dealt with." "Oh, Karen, you really should have done your homework." Because what Karen didn't know, my mother had already made a phone call, and the one who picked up was me. Enter the second police car. Just as Karen finished gloating, another set of sirens echoed down the street. A second police car pulled up, doors opened, and out stepped me. I shut the door, adjusted my uniform, and slowly walked toward the scene. Karen turned, ready to complain about more officers needing to handle this menace. Then she saw my face, and her smug little world crumbled. My mother has lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. She's seen it all. New families moving in, old neighbors moving out, kids growing up and heading off to college. What she's never gotten used to? The HOA. The Willow Creek HOA had been around for a while, but it wasn't until Karen took over that things went from mildly annoying to full-blown dictatorship. Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was a tyrannical queen, and her clipboard was her scepter. Trash cans out too early? $50 fine. Grass 2 inches too tall? Warning notice. A front door color that wasn't on the approved palette? Violation report. And if you dared question her rules, she'd just smile sweetly and say, "It's all in the best interest of the community." Translation, do what I say or suffer the consequences. Karen versus my mother. Now my mother? She's a saint, patient, kind, the type of woman who bakes cookies for new neighbors and waters other people's plants when they're out of town. But she's also stubborn as hell. And the moment Karen started handing out ridiculous fines, my mother made it very clear she wasn't going to be bullied. Karen, of course, took that as a challenge. Over the past few years, she had tried everything to make my mother's life miserable. Sent multiple warning notices about the height of her grass, even though it was professionally maintained. Tried to fine her for having a bird feeder, because apparently birdseed attracts pests. Left passive-aggressive notes about the placement of her trash can, claiming it ruined the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. And each time, my mother ignored her. But this time, Karen had gone too far. This time, she didn't just send a letter, she called the police on an elderly woman. For what? Existing in her own front yard. And that was a mistake. If there's one thing Karen loves more than her clipboard, it's authority. Not real authority, of course. She has none of that. No, Karen thrives on the illusion of power. And today, she decided to abuse it in the worst way possible. The crime of the century. It was a quiet morning. The birds were chirping. A slight breeze was rustling through the trees. My mother was sitting on her porch, peacefully enjoying a cup of tea. And then, like a storm cloud rolling in to ruin a perfect day, Karen arrived. She stomped up the driveway, clipboard gripped tightly, eyes locked onto my mother like she was a criminal mastermind in action. My mother barely looked up. "Karen," she greeted, taking another sip of tea. Karen's nostrils flared. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "I'm afraid we have a problem." My mother raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly is the problem?" Karen took a deep, exaggerated breath as if she was about to deliver the most serious news of the century. "You are in direct violation of HOA rules." My mother blinked, then took another sip of tea. "I'm sitting in my own yard." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Yes, with an unauthorized chair." The Karen logic. According to Karen, my mother's perfectly normal patio chair was a threat to the neighborhood. It's not on the approved list of outdoor furniture, Karen huffed, flipping through her clipboard. My mother stared at her. You have an approved list of chairs? Karen beamed. Of course. It's all about maintaining aesthetic harmony in the neighborhood. My mother slowly glanced down at her chair, then back up at Karen. It's a metal patio chair. It's literally the same as your chair. Karen clenched her jaw. Well, yours is too close to the sidewalk. A pause. Then my mother let out a long, slow sigh. Karen, she said calmly, do you know what I think of your approved list? Karen perked up, clearly expecting obedience. What? My mother leaned back in her chair. I think it's ridiculous. Karen's meltdown. Karen's face twitched. Then she did what Karen does best. She overreacted. Her hand shot into her purse, grabbing her phone like she was calling in a SWAT team. That's it, she barked. If you refuse to comply, I have no choice but to call the police. My mother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an unsure laugh, a genuine, entertained, fully amused laugh. Oh, please do, she said, leaning forward with a wicked grin. Karen hesitated for a second, clearly thrown off. Then, with dramatic flair, she pressed 911. And that was her biggest mistake. Because what Karen didn't know was who would be answering that call. Karen thought she had won. She stood there, smug and victorious, watching as her 911 call connected. She probably imagined the police pulling up, sirens blaring, officers jumping out to drag my mother away for the heinous crime of sitting in a chair. Unfortunately for Karen, she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Because while she was calling the police, my mother was calling me. The call that changed everything. As soon as Karen pressed 911, my mother calmly reached into her purse and pulled out her own phone. She dialed, waited a second, and when I answered, she spoke without an ounce of panic. Hey, sweetie, she said. Karen just called the cops on me. I was at my office, sipping coffee, reviewing case files. I paused. Excuse me? My mother sighed. Yes. Apparently my chair is against HOA policy, and Karen thinks that warrants an emergency response. I blinked. Then very slowly, I put my coffee down. Karen called 911 over a chair? Oh, absolutely, my mother said, chuckling lightly. She's standing right in front of me, acting like I just committed arson. I exhaled through my nose. Well, I said, smiling to myself, that's interesting. There was a pause. Then, in a much calmer tone, I added, I'll be right there. Karen has no idea what's coming. Back in the neighborhood, Karen was gloating. She had no idea who my mother was calling. She didn't care. She just stood there, arms crossed, chin high, acting like she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. Behind her, a few other HOA members gathered, watching with curiosity. This is what happens, Karen announced dramatically, when you refuse to follow the rules. My mother? She just sipped her tea, completely unfazed. Then, calmly, she said, Well, Karen, I hope you're ready. Karen scoffed. Ready for what? My mother grinned. You'll see. At that moment, in the distance, the sound of sirens echoed down the street, and for the first time since this all started, Karen didn't look so confident. Karen was glowing with self-satisfaction. She stood there, arms crossed, clipboard tucked under one arm like a royal decree, watching as her grand plan unfolded. A real police officer was here, taking notes, listening to her complaint. Finally, her power was being recognized. Karen's moment of triumph. As the officer jotted something down, Karen smirked at my mother. You see, Mrs. Thompson, she said, voice sickly sweet, this is what happens when you don't follow the rules. My mother didn't respond. She didn't argue. She just took another sip of tea, waiting. Karen didn't notice the distant sound of another police car approaching. She didn't notice the shift in atmosphere. Not yet. Instead, she turned to the officer with her most self-important look yet. Well? She said. Aren't you going to do something? The officer frowned slightly. Ma'am, what exactly is the emergency here? She is refusing to comply with HOA regulations. The officer glanced at my mother, then back at Karen. For sitting in a chair, Karen's smug smile twitched. This isn't just any chair, she snapped. It's an unapproved chair. It's too close to the sidewalk. She stopped, because that's when she heard the sirens. My arrival. The second police car rolled up, coming to a slow, if a deliberate stop. Karen perked up at first, assuming backup had arrived to reinforce her complaint. Oh, Karen, you have no idea. The car door opened, and out stepped me. Karen's world crumbles. At first, she didn't recognize me. She was too busy smoothing her blouse, preparing to welcome her reinforcements. But then, as I walked toward the scene, something shifted in her expression. Her eyes locked onto my uniform, then to my badge, then to the other officer, who immediately straightened and greeted me with respect, and just like that, her entire world came crashing down. Reality sets in. The first officer, still holding his notepad, turned to me and nodded. "Sir," he said professionally, "how are we going to handle this?" Karen visibly flinched. Her smug confidence melted like cheap ice cream in the sun. She blinked rapidly, head jerking back and forth between me and the officer, and then, in a voice that was much, much smaller than before, she squeaked, "Sir?" I smiled. And that was the moment Karen knew she had screwed up. Karen was still processing what just happened. 1 second, she was on top of the world, certain that my mother was about to be dragged away for her crimes. And now she was staring at me, the very officer she had unknowingly summoned, looking like she had just swallowed a lemon. The silence stretched. Then slowly I crossed my arms, tilted my head slightly, and asked, "Karen, what exactly made you call the police on an elderly woman?" Karen's weak excuse. Karen blinked rapidly, trying to find her footing. I told you already," she stammered, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "She was refusing to follow HOA rules." I nodded slowly, like I was carefully considering her words. Then in the most neutral, professional tone possible, I asked, "And which law did she break?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She blinked again. "Well," she fumbled, "HOA rules state that all outdoor furniture must be on the approved list, and she refused to move her chair, so I held up a hand. "Right," I said. "HOA rules." I took a slow step forward, keeping my voice calm. "And do HOA rules allow for arrests?" Karen short circuits. Karen's face went blank for half a second, as if her brain had temporarily disconnected from reality. What?" I repeated, enunciating each word carefully, like I was speaking to a child who had just realized crayons don't belong in electrical outlets. "Does HOA law allow for arrests?" Karen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She turned slightly, glancing toward the first officer, as if expecting some kind of backup. He just raised an eyebrow, waiting for her answer. She turned back to me, visibly sweating now. "I mean, we have the right to enforce community standards." "Right," I said, cutting her off. "But do you have the legal authority to have someone arrested for sitting in a chair?" Froze. For the first time since this whole thing started, she had nothing to say. And in that moment, she knew. I had her. The air was thick with tension. Karen stood there, stiff as a board, her usual smugness slowly draining from her face. The gathered neighbors watched in silence, waiting to see how this would unfold. And me? I took a slow breath, turned to my mother, and asked the most important question of the day. "Mom, what exactly did you do to get the cops called on you?" The crime my mother, still completely unbothered, took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Oh," she said lightly, "I was just watering my plants, honey." Silence. I blinked. The officer standing next to me blinked. Even a few A board members shifted uncomfortably. I turned back to Karen, who was now looking very, very nervous. "So," I said, "you called the police because an elderly woman was watering her plants?" Karen's eye twitched. "Well," she started, scrambling for an excuse, but I wasn't done. "The officer's verdict." I turned to the first officer, the one who had been diligently taking notes up until now. I gestured toward my mother, who was now casually adjusting a potted plant like this was just another Tuesday. "Do we have any legal grounds," I asked, voice calm, "to arrest a woman for watering her plants?" The officer hesitated. Then he looked at Karen. Then back at me. And then he slowly closed his notebook, Karen's face drained of color. "Karen's last stand." Wait, Karen snapped, panic creeping into her voice. She was violating HOA regulations. That's why I called. I held up a hand. Right, I said, and we've already established that HOA rules are not laws. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again, because now she had nothing left. She had just called the police over an imaginary crime. And everyone, including the cops, knew it. Karen was losing it. Her usual confidence, the smugness she carried like a second skin, was crumbling before everyone's eyes. She needed to regain control. She needed to flip the script. But the problem? There was no script left to flip. Karen's desperate attempt at control. Karen stepped forward, gripping her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But, the HOA has the right to enforce the rules. Chris, she stammered, her voice shrill with panic. She turned to the gathered neighbors, pleading now instead of commanding. If everyone just does whatever they want, this neighborhood will fall into chaos. There it was. The classic HOA fear tactic. Without her, everything would descend into anarchy. Lawns would go untrimmed. Trash cans would be left out overnight. Someone might even paint their front door an unapproved color. Karen expected agreement, support, maybe even a few HOA loyalists nodding along. Instead, silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone snorted. Another muffled a laugh, and Karen realized she was alone. I shut her down. I took a step forward, slowly, letting the moment stretch. Then, in the calmest, most professional tone possible, I said, "No, Karen." She whipped around, eyes wild. I crossed my arms. "Curiosity, you don't have the right to call the police to handle trivial matters," I continued, my voice measured but firm. "This is a public resource, Karen, not the HOA's private protection service." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She choked on her own words, sputtering like a car engine that just refused to start. For the first time in her entire reign as HOA president, she had no comeback. Shared Karen's defeat. The neighbors saw it. The officers saw it. And Karen felt it. Her power, her illusion of control was slipping through her fingers. She had overplayed her hand. And now she was paying the price. Karen had spent years ruling like a queen. She had used the HOA like her own personal kingdom. She had bullied, she had threatened, she had intimidated, and it had worked. But today, the rules were finally catching up with her, and they were her own rules. The legal process begins. I turned to the officer standing beside me. He had been watching Karen unravel with increasing amusement. I met his eyes. "File the report," I said simply. Karen visibly flinched. The officer nodded, flipping open his notebook once again. The official violations. Within minutes, the formal process was underway. The HOA received an official warning for the misuse of police resources. Karen was cited for making a false report a serious offense. And then came the real kicker. Depending on the state and local laws, making a knowingly false emergency report could lead to a fine of up to $20,000. Karen's face went white. She staggered back slightly, gripping her clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "This is a mistake," she stammered, looking around for support. But the problem? No one was on her side anymore. The neighborhood reacts. Some HOA residents had witnessed the entire thing, and now they were whispering, murmuring. Some were openly smirking, watching the great Karen crumble before their eyes. "She called the cops on an old lady and got herself fined," someone muttered. "She always acted like she was above the law," another resident said. Guess not. Karen's humiliation wasn't just public. It was becoming gossip. And in an HOA, gossip spreads like wildfire. The beginning of the end. Karen tried one last time to save herself. She turned to the first officer, eyes desperate. "There must be some way to fix this," she said, voice suddenly sickly sweet. "Surely we can find a solution." The officer raised an eyebrow. "There is," he said. Karen's eyes lit up with hope. The officer snapped his notebook shut. "Don't call 911 for ridiculous reasons," Karen choked. The neighbors. And just like that, her fall from power had officially begun. Karen had spent years ruling this neighborhood. She had fined people for the way they parked their cars. She had cited them for unapproved garden decorations. She had bullied her way into power, acting as if she were untouchable. But now, she was finished. The final HOA meeting. A few days after Karen's public humiliation, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. By now, the entire neighborhood had heard what happened. How Karen called the police on an old woman. How she got hit with legal consequences. How she had embarrassed the HOA beyond repair. The clubhouse was packed, residents eager to watch the final showdown. Karen sat at the front, clipboard nowhere to be seen, looking visibly drained. She knew what was coming. She just didn't want to admit it yet. Karen's last stand. The HOA board didn't waste time. A member, one of Karen's former allies, stood up and cleared his throat. "Karen," he said, voice steady, "we've had a lot of complaints about your leadership." Karen's jaw clenched. He continued, "And given recent events, it's clear that you've been making questionable decisions on behalf of the HOA." Karen gripped the table, fingers digging into the wood. She opened her mouth, probably ready to launch into some excuse, but before she could, someone from the audience shouted, "Just vote her out already!" A ripple of laughter and applause spread through the crowd. Karen whipped around horrified as she realized she had no supporters left. Not a single person spoke up for her. Even her closest board members avoided eye contact. And then the words she dreaded most were spoken. "I move for a vote of no confidence," someone announced. Karen froze. "I second it." The vote was quick, it was brutal, and it was unanimous. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. She sat there for a moment, staring blankly, as if her brain refused to process reality. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked out. No clipboard, no power, no legacy. Just a woman who once thought she was untouchable. Peace returns. With Karen gone, the HOA struggled to function. People stopped paying attention to the ridiculous rules. Fines disappeared overnight. And before long, the HOA itself collapsed. No one wanted it. No one needed it. And in the end, it died with Karen's reign. A simple question. A few weeks later, I was visiting my mother. She was in her garden, peacefully watering her plants, just like she always had. No one bothered her anymore. No warnings, no citations, no HOA threats. Just peace and quiet. As I was getting ready to leave, a young boy from the neighborhood rode up on his bike. He skidded to a stop, grinning up at me. "Hey," he said, "are you the guy who broke up the HOA?" I smiled. Then, after a pause, I said, "No, kid. I just come when called." The boy laughed. Then he pedaled off, disappearing down the same streets Karen once ruled. And me? I just smiled and walked away, knowing that the neighborhood had finally won.